Still to come on the Newsmakers, are military drones making the world a more dangerous place? And in Picture This, we look at the flooding wreaking havoc across the world. The drone industry is worth billions of dollars, and use of the unmanned aircraft has become a vital part of modern warfare. But drones are killing thousands of people in countries across the Middle East, prompting widespread protests against their use. But supporters say they are highly accurate and spare the lives of soldiers who would otherwise have to engage in on-the-ground combat. In a moment, I'll be joined by our panel of guests to discuss whether military drones are making the world a more violent place. But first, Alican Ayanlar has this report.
Drones have been flying in the skies above us since the Second World War.
A close-up of the control box used to control the drone.
Back then, the U.S. Air Force began experimenting with unmanned aircraft for reconnaissance and bombing raids.
Fast forward a half a century, and drones have evolved dramatically. Machines like this one, built here in Izmir, are changing the game forever.
The civilian drone industry is worth tens of millions of dollars, and it's expected to reach $1.5 billion by 2020. Drones are helping out with disaster recovery, land surveying, and conservation. They could be mobile ambulances in the not-too-distant future. And if Amazon's drone delivery trial is a success, they could even be dropping off your shopping. Back in Izmir, the possibilities have gotten this Turkish drone company excited, and they want to get ahead of the game.
I think we can use drones to actually build up a master plan to do proper irrigation and proper usage of arable agricultural land. In terms of border control, I mean, we have thousands of kilometers of border, which is very porous, especially in light of the current events happening around us. And I think it will serve as a game changer.
But there's a darker side. Drones have fundamentally changed the way wars are fought. They strike unseen from above. Human rights groups say they allow governments to carry out extrajudicial killings. And they've killed hundreds of non-combatants too in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. Predator drones are one of the most lethal weapons the U.S. military has. And now they're flying above U.S. skies, patrolling the border with Mexico. They aren't armed, but there are concerns that military technology has now entered domestic airspace. Republican presidential candidate Ben Carson has even suggested drone strikes could be an effective method of border control.
You look at some of these caves and things that are out there, one drone strike, they're gone. And they're easy to find.
Whether drones are something to be excited about or feared is still up for discussion. But the technology is developing so fast that people worried about the ethical implications risk being left behind.
While that debate is still ongoing, what's clear is that this new generation of drones is set to change our lives forever. And it won't be long until we see more and more of these in the skies above us. Alican Ayanlar, TRT World, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Chris Woods, the author of Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars. Also in the British capital is Justin Bronk, a combat air power specialist from the Royal United Services Institute. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. So, Chris Woods, we're not going to be talking about Amazon delivering people's Christmas gifts. We're clearly talking about the Predator drones and those used in the war zones of the world right now, primarily operated by the superpower. Are they destructive?
Well, they are a weapon of war, absolutely. The Predator that you were talking about in the report there, and more usually these days, the Reaper drone, these are very powerful weapons. They deliver high explosive bombs and missiles on the battlefield. But they're obviously more than that. They are also very sophisticated intelligence gathering devices. And in fact, the Americans and the British and the Israelis, I would guess, would all argue that they are, yes, they're good as weapons of war, but also, crucially, they change the way we operate on the battle space by gathering intelligence and applying that intelligence. So there's a lot of emphasis by the Americans, the Israelis, the British about precision, about the ability to hit the enemy very, very carefully and limiting the risk to civilians. That's the claim, certainly.
That's the claim, but why don't you buy it fully?
I think there are certainly circumstances where armed drones are preferable to many other weapons at the disposal of a modern military power. For example, if you send in a fast jet, you're moving at speed. You're not taking the same kind of time to carry out an airstrike, and often you'll need a bigger weapon to achieve the same effect. Drones are slow, they're more careful, and they can use smaller munitions for the same effect. So drones can represent less of a risk to civilians, but there are times when we use them on the battlefield where they're more of a problem. Because drones the operators are obviously thousands of miles away from where the actual fight is taking place, and all they can see is what the camera on the drone is showing them, and they can't see anything beyond that. So there are times when we use drones on the regular battlefield where civilians might be more at risk simply because they don't have that wide field of view. There's also the question of whether drones are lowering the threshold for war, and that's a view shared by quite a lot of senior military and intelligence officials, that really politicians are quite eager to reach for what they view as a safe form of warfare, and it means we're more likely to be pulled into these conflicts simply because we're told civilians aren't at risk anymore, and neither are our pilots, so where's the risk?
Justin, do you agree with that it lowers the threshold for war and that big powers get sucked into more conflicts than they ordinarily would get sucked into?
I think there's certainly a case to be argued on that, and the US CIA run targeted assassinations program using Predator and Reaper drones in places like Yemen, Somalia, or Pakistan. I did certainly disagree with and would agree with Chris that the lack of risk to pilots and the fact that drones can be arguably much more precise in a lot of circumstances with their weapons, which is not the same as accurate, has led politicians to, in the US, be more willing to resort to that sort of targeted assassination program because they can. On the other hand, I would suggest that the problem is more around the military's treatment of drones as a national whole. If you look at how, for example, the US Air Force, the military rather than the CIA operates their drones, they're very much confined to battlefield interdiction, reconnaissance, and support of ground troops, in which role, as Chris has already mentioned, because of the much greater time they have on station, the slower speed they fly, the smaller weapons they can use for a given effect, they are much more precise and therefore usually represent much less of a risk to civilians and friendly forces. So I think it's much more about political attitudes to the use of drones rather than the capability of the drones themselves. Let's not forget, the US has gone for high-value targets with, manned aircraft before. For example, the raids attempt to kill Gaddafi, obviously a much higher profile target, but there was always that risk of civilian casualties, but also aircrew casualties if an aircraft went down. So it may have lowered the bar, but I think the technology itself is not necessarily the problem, more the attitude of governments to using them.
Talking about that attitude, Justin, 4 drone operator whistleblowers from the United States recently came out. They said they were horrified by the cruelty that they were a part of. They said that this will bring about more terror, more civilian deaths were actually recorded internally than were reported externally. And they said it seems like our actions of late have only made the problems worse. Is particularly the US program only making things worse?
Again, I think you really need to separate out the CIA drone program, which probably is making things worse in a lot of ways, in that although it has performed a very effective decapitation of Al-Qaeda, or what was previously known as Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and elsewhere, that's actually led to a splintering of the terror group into lots of different subsets. And obviously every time civilians are hit, or even when the intended targets are the only ones hit, they still have families who then feel lasting enmity towards the United States and its allies. So certainly that can be counterproductive.
Chris, what's more outrageous, the number of civilians killed or the impersonal nature of the killing, and the fact that no matter how much it's actually affecting the drone operator, they still get to go home and do the homework with the kids and put them to bed?
Yeah, it's often described, drone warfare, as risk-free warfare, and of course that's a fantasy. What we're talking about is risk-displaced warfare. The violence is displaced elsewhere. Our military personnel are rarely now at risk on the battlefield. For example, there's not a single British military personnel member been killed in the current war in Iraq and Syria, and just one US serviceman has been killed there, in fact, in a ground attack. But the violence is simply displaced elsewhere. So what we find is not only that civilians get killed, and while it's a relatively small number compared to historic measures, it's still a lot. So hundreds of civilians have been killed by the CIA, for example, in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia. But also those local terror and militant groups that are being targeted, because they can't lash out at the attacker, which is the United States. They will often vent their anger on local security forces, local police, or even local civilian populations. And we see this time and time again in countries like Yemen and in Pakistan, where the Taliban or Al-Qaeda will attack a civilian location or an army post and add to the destabilization in these countries. And I think one of the biggest criticisms of the American policy, for example, for Yemen, is that the US has looked at Yemen through its own domestic counterterrorism needs and stopped looking at Yemen holistically and asking the question, what does Yemen need? What does the region need? And when I speak to senior US diplomats, they complain all the time that they are pushed backwards by the CIA, by the military. They're not able to do their jobs properly because the dominant force in US narratives these days is the military, is the intelligence community. And so the drones are tactically effective. They're very good at killing the bad guy. But strategically, they could be having the opposite effect and actually destabilizing the very regions America thinks it's helping.
And there were many theories that suggested, a little bit of circumstantial evidence, that Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former leader of Yemen, actually got the US drone program to do his dirty work for him. And he was identifying enemies as Al-Qaeda, who were personal enemies rather than Al-Qaeda. Final question for you, Justin. Looking to the future, it's all well and good, I guess, from many looking at it through a Western prism, for the United States to use these drones, for the UK to use these drones, for the Israelis to use these drones. What happens when, for example, China decides that it wants to take out a Uyghur separatist on the streets of London who it considers is a terrorist, and maybe 10 civilians die in that process? Are we going to ever reach that stage?
I think the particularly dangerous factor around the profusion of drone technology, though, is that, as you've hinted, China is in fact already exporting on quite a large scale, for example, to Saudi Arabia, which the US refused to sell armed drones to, is already selling its own armed versions of Predator, Reaper, and indeed is developing stealth UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles of its own. And certainly, with Chinese and Russian weapons, the record suggests they will sell them to any regime that has money. So there will not be even a veneer of political vetting before these are sold to regimes to do what they will with. Of course, the West isn't innocent on that count either.
We have run out of time, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. You guys have been a wealth of knowledge.